This video is an audio-only commentary. See the description for the complete version if you want to actually see stuff. The complete experience, if you will. Warning! The following video contains the application of logic and rational thought. If you're stupid, this video is not for you. A metaphor I thought of when it comes to pretentious media goes like this. Imagine the pretentious content floating offshore on its own island. The people who are content to sit on the shore and look out at it never analyze it to see it for what it really is, because they refuse to actually swim out to it and examine it up close for themselves. The people that don't just take it at face value, though, the ones that actually do get up close to analyze it, are the ones that are actually getting the full picture. Sometimes, you don't even have to swim out very far to get a good enough view of the island to figure it out. It's easy to just sit there with your brain turned off and watch pretentious shit and think, herp, shit's great, yo, because that's the point. It's awesome until you actually decide to think about it and figure out that there's really nothing deeper going on underneath it all. There's no deeper meaning. Random deep sounding quotes that don't mean anything. It just seems deep and significant, when in reality, it's just a front, a mask, a facade. One simple way people take pretentiousness is like this. I don't get it, so it's smart. Make it sound as complicated as possible without actually explaining anything. Big words confuse people. Actually, I recently read the book How Not to Write a Novel, and while I learned pretty much nothing from it, the one thing I did learn was that it's bad writing to stuff in big words where a smaller one would do. Using big words you don't know in an attempt to sound smarter than you actually are. Another way writing can achieve pretentiousness, when a story tries to reach heights that are clearly beyond its bounds. For example, a standard shoujo school romance that suddenly decides it wants to tackle the reason why we exist in the first place, and other such heavy philosophical topics. An appropriate response to pretentious media is, LOL deep. There are 4 layers of depth in media and writing. The first is the superficial layer, the visuals and sound, the cinematography, the art, the writing style, how it's presented, how it's delivered to the viewer or reader. The second is the story and characters, the basics of writing, the bare necessities, the meat and potatoes, the foundation, what grounds the viewer and gives them a point of reference from which to view the rest of the work. The vast majority of screen time should be focused on these things. Do the characters have a consistent and clearly defined personality? Do they have depth? Do they logically develop over time? Is the setting solidly established? Are the story's events connected? Does it flow? Is there build-up to major events? It's crucial that these things be defined and made concrete, as it establishes a point of reference on which to build deeper underlying meaning. Basically, what the fuck's going on, who the fuck these people are, where the fuck we're going, and why the fuck you should care. The third layer is meaning, overarching themes, the overall message the story is trying to convey, the point of it all, the moral of the story, the Aesops, the deeper lessons you can take away from it. A lot of the time, you can get away with just having individual characters learn things and not make the whole story necessarily revolve around one Aesop. These lessons can be interpreted as being the point of the story. The fourth and final layer is deeper and more arcane subjects, like symbolism and extraneous subliminal meanings that not everyone will pick up on. The fourth layer includes matters such as certain philosophical ordeals characters go through, and existential philosophical or metaphysical topics and stances. Also, the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. Now, pretentiousness is what happens when you somewhat neglect or completely forsake the second layer, or even the third layer as well. Pretentious media reach down and pull the fourth layer all the way up and set it on top of the second and third layers. It's what happens when the vast majority of your screen time is spent trying to be LOL deep, rather than focusing on grounded and concrete things most of the time. It goes without saying that this causes enormous problems. Let's look at the specific case of a particular character's existential ponderings. If layer 2 hasn't been able to establish a foundation, their current personality and state of mind and background and whatever, you have no point of reference to ground you and provide a basis for comparison, or build up for why they're even thinking about such subjects to begin with. It's just a talking head sputtering random philosophical garbage with no logical build-up or reason for them to even be doing so in the first place. Basically, the depth that things would have had in the fourth layer is lost, since it's the only major layer remaining. It's no longer considered deep, since the other layers no longer exist. It's all about themes and issues and is like totally serious, but it brings these points up with no idea what it's doing with them. Basically, pretentiousness is achieved when you're trying to fly before you've even learned to crawl. What does this have to do with Kara no Kyoukai? Well, everything, really. The whole series can be summarized with the word pretentious. It seems like it's good, but when you chip away the facade, you find out that it really isn't. Kara no Kyoukai almost completely ignores the second and third layers and tries to be super deep at all times, making all that could have been depth completely shallow and worthless. A lot of the dialogue and monologues end up being nothing more than philosophy lectures and musings delivered to you by talking heads. Its pretentiousness is so potent that I didn't really realize how pretentious it was until somewhere during the third movie, which was when I realized that these movies don't actually have any connection whatsoever as far as events go. The characters are just the same. This is probably due to several factors. One was that I was initially okay with being dropped in the middle of it and didn't figure out that there was hardly any connection at all between the movies until this one. The second was that the characters seemed like something. They seemed really mature, but they really weren't upon closer examination. The third is that it felt like important things were happening in the story, but in reality, they weren't. And the last was the surreal visuals and ethereal music, courtesy of Yuki Kajiura and Calafina, which, like gift wrapping usually does, did its job by trying to cover up for the writing. I'll expound upon all these points in a bit. The order in which events are shown to you in Kara no Kyoukai isn't some kind of storytelling brilliance like, say, Bakano is. There isn't some deeper underlying picture that you can only see if you watch them in the order that they were released. It's kind of like Haruhi Suzumiya, in that the order they're shown is complete nonsense. It's probably just an excuse to make Gate of Seventh Heaven, which puts all the events in actual chronological order for you. I've heard people say that this order is so that you can see the character development better, but there really isn't any to be seen in the first place. Shiki, the protagonist, seems to have some sort of occultist fan base, and I can't for the life of me figure out why. Her base personality is impossible to even try to pin down. To call her a kudere would be giving her too much credit, as she hardly prescribes to that character type in any consistently seeable manner. She's more like a drone, a doll whose actions don't have logical motivation, and whose attraction to Kokuto doesn't have any foundation or make sense whatsoever. She's just a doll that can walk and talk. She also has some random tsundere moment thrown in there at one point for no reason whatsoever. The big thing about her is that she has another side, known as the male Shiki, written in all caps and subtitles, who is just a psychopath that loves to kill people, for whatever reason. And that's it. Why does he even exist? Dunno, lol, but it's deep and stuff. There's supposed to be some psychological conflict going on between them or whatever, but it's so vague and abstract that it doesn't really feel like it's even real. Like, it's not even there in the first place. Ironically, having split personality disorder doesn't automatically give a character any depth. When you have 0 dimensions added to 0 dimensions, or at best, 0 dimensions added to 1 dimension, you still don't end up with more than 1 dimension. The other main recurring character is Kokuto, who is just a naive, idealistic, nice guy, and he happens to be pretty smart. And that's it. Basically, a nobody male lead you can find in any ecchi harem. His naivete and idealism breach into the realm of stupidity. With the things he's seen and is forced into contact with, you'd think you realize how the world actually worked. He doesn't do anything special, though he still seems to be some sort of babe magnet. Not even his sister can resist. Oh my god, that movie was bad, by the way. He and Shiki have about as much character as a rock and a piece of sheet metal. If that analogy made you scratch your head, the analogy was successful. This clown is a fucked up cross-dressing psychopath. This chick is an emotionless psychopath. This bitch is a cliche incestuous tsundere imoto. This guy is pretty much a carbon copy of Kyrie from Fate Zero. Well, the other way around, since Kara no Kyoukai was published first, due to his flat, robotic personality, nihilistic outlook, and laughably trivial motivations for doing things. Just read this conversation he has with Redhead. It takes skill to fail logic this badly. If pretentiousness could be turned into a living creature, it would be this motherfucker. Actually, I want to talk about him a bit more. Characters like these are accidents that happen when you're trying way too hard to make a villain seem deep and philosophical. There's no logical reason for him to have a personality so akin to a boulder that happens to be nihilistic. I can't even tell you how not his personality is. He can't even be accepted as something remotely human. It's more like going up against an evil robot overlord. Existential crises fall flat when it's literally just a piece of cardboard or a doll or a robot. There's absolutely nothing else to it. The talking head of pretentiousness. The only truly interesting character is the redhead, who actually has something of an interesting personality and is actually entertaining to watch, but she only really gets attention in the 4th and 5th movies, sadly. The villains feel like they're committing evil just for the sake of evil. That is to say, their motivations and backstory are pretentious bullshit. The talking head of pretentious pretentiousness being the epitome of this. Their past and psychologies are poorly presented, what little actually is anyway. They bring in a new bad guy every movie just so the movie has a conflict to revolve around. Basically, Monster of the Week format. They're always either 0, or if you're lucky, 1-dimensional, but they're just plot devices. Just a source of conflict for there to even be a story in a particular movie. Nothing more. Basically, the characters don't feel compelling or real. They feel distant and empty. The only thing that's offered in terms of character development is a relationship between Kokuto and Shiki, which doesn't even feel like any real cause is spurning it on. There sure as hell isn't any chemistry. There was definite potential for Kokuto to serve as a foil to Shiki, but it just did not work out. Also, Shiki's psychotic other half somehow goes away at one point, and the lead up and events surrounding this made no sense. The half-assed attempt at showing how this affected her psychologically was the only decent thing in the character development department. Now the story. Even in each individual Kara no Kyoukai movie, events will often not flow together well. Things will just happen. The scenes rarely connect directly with each other. The viewer is frequently just shoved into the next scene after the previous one, and the scene often doesn't have any logical connection to the one that came before. And they stick several of these out-of-place scenes together and somehow expect it to form a coherent story. Also, like I said before, the main conflict of each movie is essentially just a Monster of the Week plot, except for 2 of them. It's a formula that should be reserved for shonens. They usually do it better anyway. They at least have better context for the conflicts between the villains and the protagonists. The writers include rape merely for the sake of rape. It doesn't feel truly atrocious, nor does it invoke any real feelings of sympathy. It doesn't affect the characters involved at all. The rapist wasn't important, just a plot device to perform the rape. I applaud how seinen the show is, but their handling of some adult elements, this one in particular, are ham-fisted and just there for some cheap shock value. Also, Shiki looked like she was at least in her low 20s, but I read and found out that she's actually still a teenager. Because every protagonist in anime has to be a teenager, apparently, even in seinens. They also seem to need to shoehorn in some action scene into every movie's climax just for the sake of having one. Naturally, since the villains basically amount to lethal cardboard, it doesn't feel powerful or significant in any way. The only fight that even felt important was when Redhead actually decided to get involved, because she actually had a past with the guys she fought. Not that they were good characters themselves, though. However, I do love action, and UFO Table's battle animations are pretty much second to none. But like I already mentioned, even shonens are usually able to give better context for the battles that occur. The character interactions, if you can even call them that, are hardly believable. Like I said, they're more or less just talking heads that only possess the capacity for abstract thought and nothing else. Their minds are generally off floating in their own little worlds, and sometimes bump into each other. That's how I envision the majority of the conversations. In fact, nowhere is the pretentiousness more prevalent than in the conversations. Note the example I just showed with What's-His-Fuck. A lot of the time, the characters don't even seem to be talking to each other. They're just throwing around some weighty sounding phrases that are sometimes somewhat relevant to the situation, or sometimes relate to something someone else said. It's more like the parties involved are going through their own monologues at the same time. When this isn't happening, more often than not, their conversations don't have any logical flow. They switch topics at random. Nowhere is the dialogue more ham-fisted than in the epilogue, which is only dialogue, and is so laughably pretentious that anyone with half a brain who's paying attention will be wondering if they're high. Actually, it's pretty much just a monologue. Kokuto is essentially just standing there with a derpy smile, listening to Shiki spout a stream of incoherent thoughts. The train of thought is so hilarious that it basically amounts to a bunch of random important sounding ideas that I guess the writers somehow couldn't shoehorn into the other movies, so they made a little OVA thing dedicated only to them. Not only does it disrupt Kara no Kyokai's own canon by introducing more bullshit, it also contains numerous, massive contradictions in its own internal logic. The epilogue is so great, in fact, that I could dedicate an entire video to it. Pretentiousness is something Fate Zero wades pretty deeply into as well. A lot of the conversations that are supposed to be deep and weighty sounding don't actually accomplish anything other than that, sounding deep and weighty. Ho hum, my fellow divine king of heroes of legends of gods. Let us sip the wine of god kings from golden goblets made of righteousness. Pretentious bullshit. I wouldn't have minded the mass quantity of dialogue-only scenes the show had if more of it actually accomplished something, like characterization or progressing the story. Neon Genesis Evangelion, however, is not pretentious, a claim a lot of people seem to make. The deeper meanings are buried underneath where they should be, not the only thing present on the surface. The second and third layers are still very much there. Deep issues and thoughts weren't all that existed. Also, I heard about an interview with Hideaki Anno that said that a lot of symbolism it presented was more or less coincidental, and not actually intended as such. I find it hilarious that some people can even claim that Mahou Shoujo Madoka Magica is pretentious. The only way I could see someone reasonably reasonably claiming Madoka to be pretentious is if you're focusing only on the cinematography, which can be overwhelming if you've never seen a Shaft production before. But if you're getting that distracted by visuals, it proves that you aren't even paying attention to what's even going on underneath. Sounds kind of like Kara no Kyoukai, except Madoka is actually good. Madoka really isn't that hard to get, unless you're a retard. You don't have to make inane, ridiculous speculations, or make shit up to explain it for yourself. You just have to be able to think. The foundation is firmly established, the characters are tightly defined, their personal issues and problems are presented well. It doesn't neglect these things in favor of trying to be LOL deep. Also, if you claim Madoka is pretentious, but then turn around and claim Kara no Kyoukai or Fate Zero aren't, you're clearly double standarding. Basically, in summation, pretentiousness is what happens when you're trying to reach for the stars when you can't even plant your feet on solid ground. Pretentious media gives the false impression that it is more intellectually stimulating or thought-provoking than it actually is, favoring big words and lofty speeches over conciseness. You can't have supreme depths without first establishing solid ground. You're trying to establish depths you don't even have. You know that island of pretentiousness off floating in the sea by itself? Kara no Kyoukai isn't just on the other side of the line of pretentiousness. It hasn't just set up a camp there either. Kara no Kyoukai turned it into an entire continent because the island wasn't big enough. It then set up a fucking castle at the side of the cliff at the very farthest edge of pretentiousness. It then declared itself president of the newly created United States of Pretentiousness. I wanted to like the Garden of Sinners. I really did. The amazing visuals and music, however, were completely wasted. I couldn't even enjoy Yuki Kajiura's music in Kara no Kyoukai because I was too busy being suffocated in pretentiousness. There's a humorous irony in the fact that Kara no Kyoukai literally translates to boundary of emptiness, because that's exactly thought-provoking than it